I see that we drop the baton. So when I listen to people talking about DAOs, like I literally imagine that they see a stadium that everybody's sitting there and everybody votes together. And it's like, no, wrong.
How can we actually incentivize more of that, not just at the local territorial level, but also across community that share similar value and have kinship?
So basically, I think there's like models that are, attractors in terms of thinking about the order of the world.
What is a low-hanging fruit that we could collectively pick across movements and work together in order to bring this idea of a network nation, of, this network of networks of communities on a global scale into existence? Just one.
Welcome back to the Network Nations mini-series on the Green Pill podcast. I'm Felix, and together with Primavera de Filippi, I'm your co-host for the coming episodes. Across the world, new kinds of civic communities are beginning to take shape. Communities that use decentralized technologies, such as blockchain infrastructures or peer-to-peer networks, to govern themselves, steward shared resources, and act together across borders. We call them network nations, and in this series, we want to explore network nations as a new design space for civil society in the networked age. Our goal is to chart an alternative pathway from the network state, one where technology serves civil society, not the other way around. Instead of reproducing today's power imbalances in networked societies, we are asking, what if networked societies were built from the bottom up as shared commons, rather than from the top down as startup ventures? What if they treated members as co-creators rather than customers? What if they practiced cooperation and mutual care rather than competition and extraction? And what if they cultivated a sense of sovereignty as a collective good for the many, rather than a private asset owned by just a few? Each episode brings together thinkers, builders, and organizers who are exploring this new frontier of community self-governance together with us, helping us to imagine how a civil society can reclaim political agency in the age of networks. To dive deeper, visit our website, networknations.network, where you find our manifesto and many ways to get involved with our movement. In today's episode, we're exploring the role of the commons in the vision of network nations. We're joined by two leading voices in this space, two people who have spent the last decades reimagining how communities can build, own, and govern shared resources. We are super excited to have Sara Horowitz and Michel Bauwens on the show. Sara is the founder of the Mutualist Society and the Freelancers Union. She's a longtime advocate for cooperativist economic models and practices, and her work really centers around a simple but powerful idea. When traditional institutions fail to meet the challenges of our days, communities need to step in and create systems of care, trust, and solidarity collectively. Michel is the founder of the P2P Foundation, also a frequent guest of the Green Pill podcast, and he's one of the most influential theorists of the commons economy. Over the last 3 decades, he mapped and supported communities around the globe that use peer-to-peer networks to create and share value collectively. He's also the author of several landmark works like the Commons Manifesto, and he writes a brilliant Substack called The Fourth Generation Civilization, which we recommend you to check out. Together with these two brilliant minds, we want to explore how collective resource stewardship and ownership can build the foundation for network nations and self-sovereign communities in today's digital age. We want to really dive into questions of how might these communal ideas of ownership help us to move from a fragile, polarized society of individuals towards a more resilient and networked form of interdependence. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive into it.
Great. So thank you for being here, Michel and Sara. It is a great pleasure. So to start this episode, we would like both of you to kind of describe a little bit your own experience. You've both been very involved with many different communities that are operating through like a commoning approach or mutualistic approach, etc. So it would be nice to like try to understand what are those communities, why do they choose to operate according to those principles, and also like the extent to which beyond operating with those principles internally as a community, you have also been observing attempt or effective achievement of interconnecting among other communities that also operate of the same type.
So I founded the P2P Foundation in 2005, and I basically I started observing the scene so for about 20 years now, right? And I use the wiki to document what I see. And so I would recognize three periods in my research. The first one is free software communities, open knowledge, open design. So, 93, creation of the web and the browser, democratized access to the networks, and people start sharing massively code, knowledge, and design. So that's my first observing, was like, how do they work? Now, I would not consider these like network nations or mutualistic. They're like productive organizations. They do things together, but I'm not very much aware of like any like solidarity arrangements, or you're pretty much on your own. If you have to have state support or corporate support, or you're a freelancer, but it's very focused on doing something particular. Then there's a second group of communities that I looked at, and I would call them the urban and the rural commons. And this is already a bit different because this is local, and there is a paradox that I want to mention here. So these people know each other. So there's like a pragmatic solidarity. It's what you do with people. If you see them really suffering, you might want to do something about it. They're not like formally organized to do that, but you can just feel there's already a different atmosphere. But there's a paradox, which is, so there's a local level, and it's very local, and they hardly work together with other people doing the same things which are like close by. So typically a permaculture, east in Ghent may not work together with permaculture west in Ghent. But they do have this global permaculture design community. So there's a lot of learning going on. There's events, online events, physical events, courses. So it is circulating at that level, and then it's very local at the same time. So that would be, so far as I can kind of remember my observations. Then the third type of community I looked at is Web3. I feel there's a paradox. So I think the tension in Web3 is between a very strong individualism, because they're libertarian, most of them. Like, they're very libertarian in their ways of thinking. They want freedom above all. But then there's community. And it's not necessarily that they think about it together. They just do it. So there's very strong community. And so I was actually pleasantly surprised, and that's where I met also you guys, in Suzalu, Montenegro. I was very pleasantly surprised by the amount of like solidarity that was obvious there. That people, I wasn't doing very well at the time, and I got my taxis paid, and I just had to say something, and somebody would. So I thought that was like impressive, and the capacity, the pluralism of it was also very, very amazing in my view. And so that that created an attachment on my part on the Web3 ethos, because I thought, yeah, this is very human in some way. So it's a bit paradoxical. So, but none of these movements, are like formally the solidaristic, right? They just people doing stuff together. Uh, but so if I take on my historical hat, so so basically, when I talk about the pulsation of the commons, if you remember, that is the idea is that we have periods in history where where societies do well. There's a centrifugal pressure, things get organized, integrated, centralized, and the state takes care of its citizens, or whatever the state form is. And that has the paradoxical effect that you become a consumer of the state, right? In a way, you become a consumer of the services of the state. And that dilutes the horizontal self-organization, solidaristic elements. And then in periods when the state and the market function less well, and you have disintegration, centripetal, disintegrating, decentralizing pressures, people are in a stress situation of like, where do I get support? Where do I find a job? What happens if I lose my job? All these questions come up, and that will create a pressure for people to go back to real solidarity, because they're not getting it from the state. And I think this is where we are, right? So we come from a long period in which we didn't have to do that, and therefore lots of the commenting that took place wasn't yet informed by this really need to like to survive. It was passionate projects, things we want to do. We look for meaning in our lives. We find people everywhere in the world who wants to do the same. But it wasn't like I have to make sure that people have my back. And I think that is changing. So I think people right now are very much looking into that. And that's, I think, where network nations come in as one of the ways of thinking of like, how do we create real solidarity? And, I always like to say, maybe a bit provocatively, but that, sacrifice and solidarity are the two requirements for community, for a real community, right? If you don't have that, you're playing. If there's a bit of pressure, you move around. But if you have those two things, then you start acclimating power, because people will act in concert to protect something. And we're not there yet, but we are moving in that direction because things are obviously not going well in the world. So I think this is, and of course, depending where you live, I live in Asia where things are seemingly still going well. And so, there's a bit more social welfare now than 5 years ago. And maybe that's still the case in China. But certainly in Europe and the US, the trend is the other direction, right? So that it depends also a bit where you are.
Yeah. And on your side, Sarah, like what are your own experience of those communities?
Yeah, I think that the way Michel is describing the role of the state is actually quite interesting, and I'll get to that in a minute. I have been organizing freelance workers. Found that very interesting what you were saying about the first phase, and freelancers were really, to me, the people who were starting to organize around their own needs because they had fallen out of the social safety net. And so, to me, they were the architects of building what they needed. And I would say that, to me, has always been the way that any of this starts is, what is it that more than one person needs that you have to do in a group in order to succeed? If you can do it on your own, you really don't need this. If you actually need to form a worker cooperative or a food purchasing organization or a community garden, you cannot do that alone. And so it's really starting from that through line of need of how groups then start to organize themselves in having more and more complexity in that arrangement. And so what I think is very interesting is in the last 2 years, I've been organizing the Mutualist Society and really talking to mutualists globally and finding that it really is this notion of, I'd say, an isolation where different groups are starting to kind of emerge, starting to then see who else is doing this, and to start to see what are some problems that are affecting the whole group, which to me is the opportunity for the network nations, is to start to say, wait a minute, this probably isn't going to be a strictly libertarian operation. There's going to be some need to start to look at what are the decisions that we need to make in order to enable these groups to grow such that we start at a base, and that base then grows, is woven and connected together by their needs and their decisions, and that actually is the quarterbacking for how you build policy. And so I think one of the most important things is, and let me just say, I think that there's a very interesting Venn diagram around commoning and mutualism. And mutualism, there's 3 principles. One is it has to have a solidaristic group. And by that, it just means that, whether you're a knitter or a farmer, you kind of know who's a knitter and a farmer, and you kind of know who isn't. It's not just open. It's not a park. It's not a library. Parks and libraries are wonderful. They're just slightly different. The second is it has to have an economic mechanism. It has to be services or dues or a lending circle. And the third is that it has to have a long-term time horizon. So to me, what I think is interesting about network nations as a concept is looking for the organizations that have a commoning orientation and a mutualist orientation, and maybe even others that in creating that ecosystem. And that's what I think is interesting, is to see it in a kind of mosaic and weaving rather than a monolith.
I wanted to make a small remark on the relation between commoning and mutualism. I find it very interesting and fruitful. I have a slightly different framing in which I look at it historically. So you have basically physical commons, and the focus is not on solidarity, but on common access to resource that people need. So, fisheries and mountain flanks and common pastures, all of that. When we have the big enclosure movement in the 16th century and even earlier in the 13th century, and people start being chasing away to the cities as proletarians, that's when mutualism becomes a big need, because they mutualize risk, life risk, and that's I think where mutualism then come from. And it wasn't invented then, because it existed in the in the free city states of the Middle Ages and in the Ottoman Empire. So it's like guilds and stuff is pretty standard stuff. But I think there is a very strong relation between commoning and mutualism. Their domains are different, but I think there's a family link. So I just wanted to say that yeah.
Felix?
Yeah, I just want to come in real quick. So you both kind of described this macro historical and political trend that forces more and more communities into considering, to organize in these mutualistic or solidaristic ways. And we see this all over the place, right? Popping up, like communities organizing, often on a local level, but they're very much in a patchwork at the moment, right? In the commons community and in the mutualistic community, I think we're observing the same thing, even in the Web3 space. So there's a clear need and desire to collectively organize at a scale where you can have actually an impact. But and as you both say, like network nations can provide like an institutional wrapper to facilitate this kind of governance at like the network level. So integrating all these local nodes into a larger political entity. But this is obviously a consideration which is also not completely new. And there have been attempts in the past in both of your communities, I suppose, as well, right? The comms movement and the mutualistic movement. So why have we not seen the emergence of such an entity? And what would a network nation have to look like in order to actually facilitate that effectively?
I really think something happened in the 1990s when we started talking about scale, that it actually trips us up, because it makes us feel like we need to start at a point of impact first. And what we really have to see is that it's a runway. And so what I think really the secret here is, for me, one of the biggest issues is people need access to appropriate capital. There are no capital markets that are really appropriate, except somewhat in Spain, somewhat in Italy, and probably in other places too. But it's realizing that you have to start with this patchwork of groups and really find out what they need, and then keep letting them grow, and then the policy can come in to start to change laws. If you look at Madrigal in Spain, it's exactly how it started, right? It started as a training educational program amidst a fascist government. By the time it started reaching maturity, instead of living in the cracks and crevices, it started to dictate policy. And now it's the economic juggernaut of the region. And I was just there, and you can be sure that the top officials not only have ministers there, but they're there. So I think they're the metaphor in many ways for that.
I would like to stress the importance of some transcendent element to achieve high levels of organization as well. So I think first you have religions, and the guilds are linked to religion. Like every guild in Italy has a patron saint, and it's linked to the local and probably a larger church as well. And it also motivates people to organize the higher scale. Then after secularization sets in the West, we have ideological movements. I used to be part of the socialist movement when I was younger, and it was still really strong, and people believed in it. and every village in the Flanders where I lived had a people's house and the socialist pub, and so there was something there that bound people together. And I think we are still missing that. So we're still missing some kind of motivational ideology that we don't have, and in my more naive years, I thought commoning, the ideology of the commons might be that, but it hasn't really, I don't feel it has happened. And paradoxically, I do think the blockchain has actually that kind of effect. This kind of particular, I know it's provocative, but I like to say that probably to provoke. I say blockchain is Jesus, right? Because I follow Coach Karatani's idea that people always want to go back to this convivial stage at a higher level of complexity, right? So you have commoning and gifting. That's what people want, to trust people, to have friends, to have family, that everything is smooth and warm. But then civilization destroys that. And then we want to go back. So we do that first through world religions and then through these secular utopian movements. And I think we are at a stage of constructive networks. But what can bind those constructive networks is not clear yet. But certainly, blockchain ideology itself paradoxically functions, right? Like many people know DAOs don't really work very well, and it doesn't matter. It's the belief in DAOs that functions to bind people together. But is that enough for the broad mass? I don't know yet. But so I would also like to introduce a concept that I myself just learned about from Venkatesh Rao, which I think is very illuminating, which is cosmopolies, right? So I used to think that, with digital technology, we now have something entirely new that can create these network nation and translocal organization. But he reminded me that, no, this has been going on forever. So we always had a mix of territorial and non-territorial. The Pope, the Caliph were already the heads of non-territorial communities. And so you always have cosmopolies, more or less organized, from the Republic of Letters, which is more like informal, to very, international guilds and all kinds of really existing transnational. Of course, now we have a technology which kind of supercharges it. I still think that is true. But what is going to bind it? This is my big question. I don't know. And right now, it's the blockchain, which is, let's say the most imaginative, ambitious people, they're thinking blockchain. But there's still such a rift between that layer, that cosmopolitan layer, if you like, of post-national kind of mentalities, and the people who are rooted still in their region and locality, and may not think that way at all, and may even reject it for, because they don't like technology. Or so we have a problem here that I don't know yet how humanity is going to solve.
Yeah, I want to take the opportunity to actually bring. So, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is like there is the commoning, which is managing common pool resources or putting resources in common, which can become then mutualized resources to some extent. But that's really more on the production and consumption level. And then you have like the mutualist approach, which is more like the solidarity of like, we want to make sure that everyone is fine. And so we're going to provide services and support each other, right? So one of the questions I think that we're also trying to understand is like, those we can observe a lot of realities in which those things happen, but we can observe less so. Maybe like some exceptional case, of course, exist, but it's not a common practice that we can see these intra-community. So multiple communities that have their own commoning and perhaps their own mutualist approaches that all of a sudden are like, well, actually, I want to common, or I also want to extend my mutualistic approach to other community. And I think, Michel, that's pretty much what you're touching at, which is the question of like, why would we do that? It is easy in the local territory where there is this kind of like relation. It becomes much harder when we move outside of a territory where this relationship doesn't exist. And I think this is where we come in with the network nation approach, which is, well, actually, we can see that there is reasons to do that when and only when there is this sense of community, this sense of kinship, this sense of nationhood that emerge, in which I wanna protect my people. I want to know that the people that are part of the same tribe, they feel good. And so this goes beyond a collective or a guild of fishermen wanting to manage a fishery, but it's actually, I want to make sure that everyone is okay. So we have this word within like the network nation approach, which is entanglement, which I would love to actually pick both of your brains on that, because like I feel like I would say entanglement is probably both a consequence but also a source of mutualism, meaning that if I'm entangled with people, I will be more likely to want to make sure that everyone is okay. But also, as I engage in those practices, I am creating kinship with those people. And I will say perhaps commons is the same, which is like I will choose to put things in common with the people that I care about and that I want to support. But the fact that now we have stuff in common, we're entangled, right? So I would love to hear from both of your side. Like, first of all, like, how do you see the relationship between commoning, mutualism, and entanglement? And if you have ideas, because we're exploring those questions, if you have ideas about like building from the scholarship of common and the empirical example of commoning and mutualism, is like, what can we do? Like, how can we actually incentivize more of that, not just at the local territorial level, but also across community that share similar value and have kinship?
So I recently wrote an article on the geopolitics cosmolocalism. And so basically, I think there's like three models that are, attractors in terms of like thinking about the order of the world. And so there is like a Western model, based on individualism, conflict, democracy, markets, trade. And I think it's kind of represented by the WEF, the World Economic Forum. And the idea is, multi-stakeholder domains with finance, capital, weak nation states, and approved NGOs. And they kind of, an expert class that decides like how to organize these different domains. But there's no people. Like there's no sovereignty anymore. It just kind of disappeared. And then there's this other force that wants to go back to sovereignty. And that, is Russia, China, the BRICS. And, they kind of want to go back to the United Nations, but without Western hegemony and even with civilizational, elements infused. So, people talk about the civilization states approach, like a post-Westphalian nation state approach. So that's the other model, right? Where like, it's kind of paradoxical. They're more authoritarian, but they actually believe in popular sovereignty, in their way of thinking that, like the Chinese party believes, it represents the people. They really believe that. And that's the model they have. And it seems that the Western model is declining and that model is going up, and who knows for how long. And because there's climate issues, there's resource issues, there's danger of hegemonic war. So it's hard to say how these things will evolve, but I think that there's a third option, and I called it the archipelago of regenerative villages. And I think especially, for example, in Europe, which is decaying very fast in my view, because I travel there like every 18 months, and it's just like every time I go there, it's worse than the last time. And the same in the US. I was in San Francisco recently, and I thought, oh my God, anyway, so it's decaying. And paradoxically, that motivates people, right? More to look for alternatives. And we have very strong civil society with highly educated people. And so that third option, I think, is real. Is like people doing things on the ground because they want a better life, more meaning, more solidarity. And then they look like, how can we get stronger? Okay, so this gets me to the entanglement issue, and especially around capital. Because if you look at it, and I did this study in Ghent in 2016 or 17, and I looked at 500 urban commons, and typically, there were two people working half-time for an NGO and getting burnouts every 5 years and being replaced by other people. Like that's the scene. So the people doing all this extraordinary good work, they're impoverished, they're precarious, they don't have capital. So, and that's the paradox. If you do something regenerative, there's no capital. And I think there's an opportunity, and that's, what I call the cosmolocal financing facility, right? And I use the historical analogy of, so the Roman Empire is going down, and people are leaving the cities, and you have these monasteries that are doing well, and people are looking to live around them. And at some point there is kind of a merger between the old Roman elites and the church, and they start investing in it because it's in their interest, right? And so I see today this $3 trillion of floating capital, an exit strategy from post-national people, but it's not going to work because people are going to go after them with pitchforks when things get really bad, right? And so I think there is an historical opportunity to attract part of that capital for investing in regenerative entities. And that, I think, is where the network nations come in. Like, I see federations or regenerative projects creating common digital identities and trying to attract this kind of capital. And there, the entanglement would be, in terms of micro capital, right? Because I think this is very important. Like Materium, I really like what they've been doing. It's basically you can bypass venture capital, big banks, BlackRock, by doing crowdfunding, crowd lending, crowd investments. And so you can imagine forms of capital where you have like 70% local and 30% non-local, right? So you keep control of the local, but you attract these people, and it sounds like utopian, but that's how the Middle Ages worked. This is how the Ottoman Empire worked. This is how pre-modern decentralized societies worked. They had, people were very local, and people were moving around like the guilds, the cathedral builders. Um, so I think this is possible, and I personally want to work to make that possible, right? And yeah, so that's kind of entanglement, is this kind of combination of, let's say, the bioregional guilds and the cosmolocal guilds. Bioregionalism functions as a horizontal solidarity, all people doing different things in the same region, and cosmolocal is all people doing the same thing all over the world. And those two things come together to create like a defense mechanism for this archipelago. And they can have good relationships locally if they want to, if they can. But if they don't get local friendly state, they can defend themselves to that translocal aspect.
So to you, the entanglement, just to understand, you're using the word entanglement to describe that interwoven network of financial investments.
Yeah, but also people that can move around. So for example, you have a network of eco villages, and I heard they have a passport now. The what's it called? I forgot the name, but there's like a global organization for eco village. They don't call it a passport because they don't want to attract attention, but they have
Bad
some kind of
connotation.
password. They have some kind of password. So this is like really interesting that they're doing that. So that people can move between those eco villages, and they have some kind of privileges because they belong to that federation.
So it's
So
like mutualized identity system.
yeah, like
Identification
the guilds in
system.
the Middle Ages. If you were like a
Mhm.
member of a guild in the Middle Ages, you had halfway houses throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Like if you were part of a Venetian guild, you could go to Marrakesh, you could go to Ghent, and there'll be a house for you.
Mhm.
This is what I'm really worried about. I think that when I look at the energy needs of AI and data centers, and I look at foreign policies of nation states are now enabling that growth at an exponential and existential rate, I start to really worry about and I hear a lot of talk, and especially in Montenegro, of exit, that people are thinking about a nation state or a network state as a way for a group of people who have the most means to exit a lot of things that planet Earth is having a problem with. I take that really seriously. And so when I look at how are we building, I really am trying to think about how do people start to organize to get food, shelter, housing, health, that in this context. So it's not abstract at all. Not that this conversation has been abstract in any way, but I think the outside looks like we're discussing this in a laboratory, but I don't think any of us actually feel like we are. So to me, in that, the idea of entanglements is that we're going to have to start to work together. You know, it's a wonderful thing to be an individual if you're young and rich, right? It's
Sure.
never better. You can do what you want and you don't have obligations. But the truth is, in unions and cooperatives and in faith communities, you know that something's real because people don't get along because they're human. And there are mechanisms for them to navigate that. And that is just at the node level. But that I think what we're going to need around these entanglements is actually looking at the metaphors for the federated bodies that always exist. So every trade union has a federating system of different locals to different nationals. And then even the national unions have international federating bodies. And so they didn't come out of some abstraction, they came out of actually figuring out needs and trade and trading information. So I think that there's something about in this context that we are going to start to see this need for people to start to federate and figure out what those practices are. I don't think that starts with government, actually. I think that that starts with people coming together and then saying what it is they need. Right now, I think what they need is capital, and so that you can start to have these groups have the ability to grow, and they need to grow either with something that is like a grant or a very low interest loan, and starting to go from there.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think like the narrative of exit is precisely what we with the network nation thing are trying to countervail with actually not just saying we don't want to exit, but actually saying that interdependence is desirable. It's something we have to cope with anyways. Like we cannot escape from it, but actually we even want more of it because we want to be more entangled with the people that we resonate with and with whom we want to have this kind of like solidarity.
One thing that I really am seeing that I think is an interesting issue, and Michelle sort of was talking about this a bit too, is I look at the way people in Web3 organize. And what the way I think of it is these generations that came before up to the 90s were passing the baton because they had institutions that taught one generation how to manage and to build for the future. And then after the 90s, when we destroyed so much of the social sector, both especially in the United States, I see that we dropped the baton. So when I listen to people talking about DAOs, like I literally imagine that they see a stadium that everybody's sitting there and everybody votes together. And it's like, no, wrong. And the level of sophistication and governance is so shocking from such very intelligent people. And I would say that has been very striking to me in 2 years, that people don't understand it's not just quadratic voting, it's really having forms of delegation of authority and power, and that those aren't bad things. They just have to be designed properly by people with an ability to iterate when they don't work, and they don't work all the time.
Yeah, I think there's a great relearning that is taking place, but I think there's a psychological change. When you have the level of social disintegration that we see in the West, people are going to get experiences where it becomes really important, like who can I count on? I had that myself, and my life has changed. Like I always say, I've become more feudal, and I mean that in a special way, that I want to be able to trust the people I work with. Not that they like look the other way when something happens. Um,
Mhm.
when you're in a rich and you can go anywhere, that doesn't matter so much. But it is going to start to matter more and more. And we'll have to go into like a accelerated learning because it's becoming existential to find these ways of solidarity. But I see it happening in many different ways. Like the Broodfonds in Holland. I work for Smart, which had like 30,000 full members and 300,000 like light members. I think people are starting to look, and I think you should look at exit not just in a negative way. There's a negative exit, which is, as long as I make it, I don't care. But there's also a positive exit. Is like the old system doesn't work anymore, and we have to find another way to do things and to survive. Right. So I would also think that exit, in terms of like when you realize that maybe you're not going to get your pension, that you counted on, and that's also an exit. You didn't choose it. It's because your society is not working as well as it used to, and so if you think about the Middle Ages, all the people in the cities in Europe were farmers who fled the farm, right? There was a law that if you fled 1 year and your master didn't catch you, you were free. And so they end up in these cities and they have nothing, nothing. There was no state. So that's where the guilds come from like a really, existential motivation. Like we can only count on each other. And those times I think are coming back.
I want to poke at the question of exit a little bit further, because I think this is also like it's another important point that we're trying to elaborate and crystallize with the network nation framework, which is one way is exiting and the other way is like, which is substrative, is like I'm leaving this system and I'm going to another system. And when we're thinking the terms of the network nation, we're thinking more in an additive layer, which is like we're not really exiting, we're just adding something in order to fill the gap, right? Because that which the state is no longer providing, that which the corporate world is providing in a slightly distorted manner, it's not that we want to exit the system, it's just that the system needs more. And I think this is like the more traditional commons approach, which is
Mm.
it's not like we're exiting everything and we're off grid. It's rather let's bring the commons back into the picture, but it doesn't require exiting. It's actually quite the opposite. It's like let's be even more entangled and let's add an additional layer
Yeah, but it's
of
also the system
yeah.
is exiting you, right? The system is exiting you because they're no longer providing support, and so
Right.
you're
Yeah. But I think there is an important distinction to be made
yeah,
between the more like, libertarian approach of like, I'm
yeah,
exiting,
yeah.
the government is failing me, I'm exiting and I'm starting something from scratch with all the complexity that is entails, versus the government is failing me. How do I fill the gap? And potentially, how do I find partnership in the same way as like, public commons partnership that can be a
I think there's something else here, which is you need these organized institutions of people who have their own power and resources and self-financing, because they actually have to exist as a counterweight. They are a check and balance. Like part of what has happened in the last 30 years is the governments, even in Europe, really have been backing the corporate interests so much more. And so they're now able to look at, antitrust laws and the platforms. Now there's a time to say, it's not that we're asking government to be kind and nice. It's that people have the authority and power because they can make change happen. And I think that we shouldn't forget, like commenting and mutualism are really, really the keys, and they're the keys and the root system to actual building power. And that, I think, is what we really have to be thinking about here, because you want to create not just incentives for people to get together, but to have the authority to determine what happens to the water that we drink. how are we enriching the soil? How are we preventing climate change? All of those were changes that happen not because we were having an Earth that was focused on humanity per se.
And I think what's interesting is that, and I think both of you are already riffing on this, is that with network nations and similar frameworks, we are not trying to build a power from an individualistic point of view, right? Like the network state, in comparison, is a quite libertarian or corporate model, right? The inspiring book is, of course, The Sovereign Individual, which tries to use network governance in order to enhance individual autonomy, basically, right? The starting point here is quite different. So we are thinking about self-sovereign community networks, which are bottom-up organizing around shared needs and urgencies actually in the world in order to enhance collectively their impact. So it's a very different theory of power and theory of change. And I think also something, Michel, you touched on it as well, is if we're thinking now about the institutional wrapper we need to build in order to facilitate this kind of like bottom-up community governance, then it's not enough to think about like technological systems, right? Like a DAO is a nice thing, but it is not an institution itself. An institution is a socio-technical system. So it has, on the one hand side, like sophisticated governance designs which allow it to organize at scale, but it also needs a shared culture and identity, like a sense of nationhood, a sense of shared belonging, and some sort of like, forms of legitimacy, accountability, and responsibility. So norms and values that make the thing be operational. And that's often lacking. I mean, Web3 is building a lot of interesting tooling, but it's lacking the institutional dimension and the national dimension. So I just want to ask the two of you what are actually the next steps we can take in order to build these more sophisticated, more embedded kind of institutional forms that are actually enabling communities to scale up from the bottom, from the grassroots to a global translocal scale.
I've been thinking about that a lot in the 2 years with the Mutualist Society because, Michael Zargom and others have really been thinking about mutualist tech infrastructure. And I find there's kind of a paradox. On the one hand, it's very easy to enter and start anything, with Squarespace and Substack, and everything is so plug and play, but it gets you onto the wrong highway. And so it kind of helps you get the first few miles going. And so I've really been thinking a lot about, and I think this is not unusual to think about, how do you put things in technological systems that are a little bit rudimentary in the beginning? And I say that really importantly. So keeping track, one of the biggest things I think is an example of, let's say, a Facebook group. Like, what's wrong with a Facebook group? Well, they don't give you notifications like you need to elect leaders. Why don't you start passing the hat and having a dues system? They don't want you to build independent institutions because you would exit. And so what is really important is to use the platforms to start and really start to hack at them to figure out how you then build something. And I would say that's like a very practical step for the here and the now. But I think that goes to the idea of a network nation, is to start to pay attention to what would be systems that are useful and how do you create processes, because I think that starts building the infrastructure for governance. And that really is the important thing. Like, you don't have to get things right. You just have to have the ability to change them when they go wrong. And that's called iteration. We all know that's really important. So yeah, I think that, to me, building mutualist tech infrastructure is really important.
I think that, it's to start from the people, right? So, for example, one of my frustrations with Web3 is, okay, you built these amazing funding mechanisms, but it's coders applying for funds as coders. And they say, oh, we should do this, we should do that. For example, oh, let's have a piece of software that connects organic consumers and organic producers. Well, guys, there's like maybe 400 of them already. Why don't you check it? Why don't you know that? But they don't, and they don't look it up. And so they're completely divorced from the kind of communities that I studied in 2017, the urban and the rural commons. And so I think it has to be turned around. It's like these people who are doing this, and they're like small groups of people who trust each other at first, and then they, slowly scale. And these people need tools to scale. But why don't we have people who ask them what they want, right? And start from their needs. And so that's hardly happening. And so that's the problem today, and that's what I want to change, is that this complete disconnect between these two worlds is
Right.
detrimental.
Right, but
Because
can I maybe follow up really quick on this point, because
yeah,
I think it's an interesting one. So what would be needed in order to flip this around?
Well, I think there's a really good example about mutual aid networks, which have cropped up everywhere all the time. One of the things that I've watched is the foundation worlds go in to fund them, and instead of saying, "What do you need? How do you build it?" It's, "Here's the advocacy agenda.
Mm.
Go. Can you make sure to plug into that?" And that advocacy agenda was very typically created by management consultants. And under the category of you can't make this stuff up, it hasn't built that kind of infrastructure. So I think it really is maybe looking for one example that might be widespread and start to try to build that and watch how that grows. Because I do think that sometimes it gets very heady, that like we want to think about like the complex infrastructure. But actually, like when you get down to it, I really think like you're walking around with your yellow pad and you're saying like, what do you need? And you're deeply listening and you're seeing the patterns and you're network building from there, which is kind of like what entrepreneurs know how to do. So we do need to go back to that orientation, I think.
yeah, one of the things that I wanted to do with my wiki is that, really that people know what is working, because I personally believe, yes, there's a lot of experimentation, and that's good and healthy, but in the end, it's a few things that work really well that get emulated and become the norm, right? And people tend to forget that it's not just like 1,000. No. For example, Will Ruddick with Network is now doing very well, and people are flocking to it because it's working. And so whether he is a perfect system or not doesn't matter, because it's working well enough, and so that gets emulated, right? And so I think that also these stories should be circulating what is working, and
Right.
it's never like the best technical system that is working. It's almost always like a mismatch of things that just pragmatically were put together, but because of the charisma and the trust of a small group of people, that is what gets emulated. And so this kind of human experience is what we need to pay much more attention to.
And I think also when we often talk about the strategy of how to build like sophisticated governance, many people often apply a very managerial engineering mindset in terms of linear planning, right, Michel? That's something you, I think, have like build on right now. Like there is this idea that we can foresee a specific future, and then we can have like, backward planning and like define steps and then technical mechanisms to achieve these steps. But that's not how the complexity of the
Yeah,
world often works, right? We
I
know that
I look
we have
at history.
learning cycles, right? It's iterative learning. And in
Yeah,
this way, it's also a collective endeavor, because we can learn from each other's best practices, but also from each other's failures. But we need this collective sense making infrastructure in order to weave these
right.
experiences together. So maybe, do you have some concrete idea? Because like network nations and many other approaches are an urgent need for this kind of sense making infrastructure. Like, how can we build this, you think?
So this is what I would do. So some years ago, I was working with David Bollier and Silke Helfrich, the Common Strategies Group, and we would do deep dives, right? And deep dives were like every 6 months. We did that for 5, 6 years in a row. 25, 30 people, 5 days, and bringing two different groups together, like the commons and the co-ops, the commons and ethical finance, the free software and open hardware. And they, like, to your surprise, or maybe not, they actually didn't talk to each other, even though they're the same ethics, but they didn't talk to each other.
Right.
And by letting them know their language, their subjectivities over time, like, it was amazing. 18 months after our deep dive, there would always be like 5, 6 projects that didn't exist before. So I would do that, domain specific. Let's get people doing, organic food. let's bring them together and get Web3, right? And let them talk together so that they know, so that the people who do this high level coordination, can actually start understanding what the needs are of the people on the ground. So that's what I would do, to stimulate this connection between those two worlds that are not talking to each other. Because I do think that, if we want social power, we do need some of these tools. We need capital. We need fast learning. We need. I think that's our only hope, because I think the rapidity of the interlocking collapse is very bad, is very fast, but we also are learning already 8 times faster than 20 years ago, right? And that's good news, so that we can also react and learn a lot faster. But we've got to do it from the ground up, from the people in the field who know how to do things.
Yeah. I think that we've been trying to do is bring together mutualists from co-ops and unions and faith and DAOs and social entrepreneurs to come together and to start to build relationships through these ideas of pods, which are learnings, where people can teach and learn from one another. And now we've been building out workshops which do that, like give people an ability to have a round table of a 360 point of view. And I think that is probably the most important, is to realize like nobody has the 360 right now.
Right.
And
Right.
that is probably the essential problem. And now I think it is really starting to create ecosystems around groups of people, who can come together to solve what they need as an ecosystem, and then have those ecosystems be fluid in their networks. So they're not um, they're not closed systems, they're open systems, but you still have some solidarity around the community. So we focus on mutualist practitioners, people who are on the ground doing things, but that obviously would work nicely with the network nations, with entanglements, because people could come into the network to start to find who would be helpful to fill out a 360. And I think that's what we're going to start to see, is these nodes, then Mutualist Society as a network, others are networks, and then looking at a full ecosystem.
And just to comment, last comment, and I play it into you, P. But I think an interesting point you're touching on here is there is a need for a point of convergence and an umbrella for adjacent movements to learn about each other. So there needs to be signaling, right? Hey, we're here, we're doing these things you just mentioned, and to converge and coordinate and share. And this kind of needs a meme or a narrative or a trope, which is broad enough as an umbrella to encapsulate many of these things. I think we're not trying to say that Network Nations is the only one capable of doing this, but I think this is how we try to design and think of it also as an integrative function, as an integrative movement that allows to build a platform for many of these already existing and it's partially like established movements, like the commons movement, like the mutualistic movement, and many others, regenerative movements, to come together and see where they're overlapping, because there is a shared interest across these communities for building these large-scale governance structures.
And therein lies the cultural difference, right? If you were doing this 30 years ago, everybody would be having big territorial fights. You don't have to have a territorial fight here, because actually the power is having the organization and many networks being able to be connected to one another. So if you close your network, like it's not going to work. And it also has to be politically heterodox. So this is going to be a culture of kindness. This is going to be a culture of openness, because it has to be. And I think that's really important in moving away from a notion of individualism. You have to be thinking about, what are the connections? How do you help build something? Don't just critique. Don't just say no, say how.
Yeah, it's a pity actually, but I still wanna pick your brain, Sarah. I think like there's one thing that also like oftentimes comes in when we talk about like commons, mutualism, and things like this, which is that basically if you don't have like a very good governance structure, which includes mechanisms of monitoring, ensuring that people actually are following all the rules, and potentially sanctioning the people that do not follow those rules. There is always the risk of free riding. There is the risk of over exploitation, under contribution, and so forth. And like this is, yes, of course, we can monitor and sanction, and then we can solve the problem. What I was curious to hear from you, and Michel, if he comes back, is if you had experience within the community that you've been working on, in which alternative mechanisms, how do we solve the tragedy of the commons without having to necessarily abide by this system of monitoring, of sanctioning? One of the underlying hypotheses that we have within the network nation framework is that we can actually avoid the tragedy of the common if we have sufficient degrees of entanglement, because obviously you don't want to free ride on your own people. So I'm curious, but this is an hypothesis. This is a strong hypothesis that we have, but of course we need to validate it. So I was curious if within the community you've encountered, both of you, have you been exploring community that did identify, whether through entanglement or perhaps through other means, mechanisms that are not monetary and sanctionings and that somehow avoid or resolve the tragedy of the common?
I would say one thing that comes to mind is the stories of the sick societies of 100 years ago, where people would pool their resources, obviously, so that when somebody was sick, they would be able to get health care. And surprisingly, what people don't realize is that the committees that would decide would go to the person's house and be like, Joe, you're not that sick, up and out, you're going to work. And I think of that really as an important point, because we think, oh my God, that's so nice. They pooled their resources, because that was a perfect example of entanglement. I know you're not really sick. You just drank too much. Get out of bed, because we're not paying for you to have a sick day. Right. And so
But
what I
isn't that
think,
exactly what monitoring will be? Just a
yes,
very strong
exactly.
monitoring.
But it's what I think we do sometimes is it is exactly an example of monitoring. And so what I'm saying is what happens is the first step is bringing people together so they actually have a point of view. Then the second part is to then start to be thinking about these monitoring systems. But sometimes I think that we prioritize the monitoring, I think, will come organically, because it's not abstract. There's a set of resources. It's like musical chairs. There's 10 people who want 8 chairs. It's just the truth. And you have to make hard decisions. And that's when the group will do it and will set up their protocols. But I think oftentimes we go to set up these systems that get overly complicated and overly regulated. Let's have a set of shared resources. Let's have some disagreement. Let's then notice what those disagreements are and build our systems around it. And so I would say it kind of goes back to some of our earlier discussions about starting from the ground up. Don't worry so much about monitoring. Let people have their problems. That's how you know you really have an entanglement. Then set up your processes.
I would just like to mention my experience with Smart, maybe because I thought that was a really great formula. So this is for freelancers, and so you join them, and you have an account where they'll do your invoices, and it goes to an account. After 6 months, they'll calculate with some kind of algorithm how much you can pay yourself based on an average of your income, right? At that moment, you become an employee of the co-op. And so you're both employer and employee of the co-op. And then basically you get all the protections of the social state, even though you're an independent freelancer, right? And they call these autonomous workers. And I thought it was absolutely a great formula. It worked quite well. They have 30,000 full members in 9 countries. And these people have unemployment, have healthcare, have everything that an employee has, but an employee has a subordination contract and they are free workers. And unfortunately, I try to convince them to go transnational because people like me, like I leave my country, they ask me to, to deregister from everything. So, and I'm not allowed to work in Thailand officially, right? So, and there's 50 million of us. There's 50 million digital nomads in the world. So there's this huge opportunity, and I would not mind like exporting the national to the transnational. What I mean is that you could still join your Belgian protection mechanism right from anywhere in the world. There would be like a translation layer between your nation and the transnational situation. Anyway, so I think we need these kinds of mechanisms that, I know that doesn't respond to your question maybe, but
No, but I think it's interesting because it also gives us an idea of what could be achieved and worked on together. And I want to close this very interesting conversation with a short question. But we talked about the idea of network nations being maybe an integrated function, right? Like creating intersections and opportunities for collaboration across different movements with, shared intentions to collaborate at a global scale. What is a low-hanging, just name one, what is a low-hanging fruit that we could collectively pick across movements and work together in order to bring this idea of a network nation, of, like this network of networks of communities on a global scale into existence? Just one.
Okay, one project that I find interesting, which seems to be able to scale, is Will Ruddick with his commitment pooling. I have to say, so the story probably, starting with 1,000 rotating savings and loans associations in Kenya, putting some of their money in a common pool, creating a first mutual credit, an alternative currency for their community with like 8 times more value than they had put in, but it works because of the collateral. Then he did the cyber physicalization of sharing practices. He went to talk to these, tribal chiefs and how they were doing and then trying to digitalize it, and then commitment pooling. And I'm gonna be part of it. Basically, you can make commitments. Like I can say I want to teach 40 hours doing this at this, and people can buy that value, can invest in that value. You're committed to do it, and it becomes like multilateral exchange of value. And this is going very well. Like this is growing, in Colombia, in Malaysia, starting from the slums of Kenya. So I think we have to look at real cases like that. Like, what is actually working? And like Benedictine rule is like one guy made up 8 rules, a bit like Ostrom, but there's more than 8 rules. But anyway, and it became the rule for thousands and thousands of communities following that rule and having a common identity. So this is the way it's going to work, with people who are successful locally and then get emulated, and we have to know that, right? That's the thing, why the knowledge has to circulate about what is working and what is not working. I think that's very important.
I think the low-hanging fruit would be setting up very local capital pools and enabling people to apply for that money, and then setting aside each stage for some which ones survive and do well, and then seeing how they go, because I think that would be a game changer.
Thank you so much for this super enlightening conversation. It's great to talk to not only two great thinkers, but also community builders. And I guess this conversation was also a way to extend the invitation to your communities as well to come in and start putting logs on the fire and build together with us or co-create this idea of a network nation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Felix.
And
Thank you, Primavera.
please, as we close, can you please let us know how do we get in touch with you? How can we follow your work?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, it's very easy. wiki.p2pfoundation.net. and then Fourth Civilization Substack, where I write every 2 weeks about these types of issues. And I'm more on the tactical, strategical kind of monitoring. So yeah, that's where you can find me.
So our network can be accessed at mutualistsociety.net. We're running pods in the fall, so if that's something that's interesting, but usually on everything from beekeeping to mycelium networks to mutualist banking and indivisible reserves, teaching and learning. And we're going to be launching something in the next couple weeks. So come and sign up and be a part of it. That would be great. And thank you so much. Really, this is a great conversation, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to see Sara again, and also you too.
I hope we will
I'll
gather
be
again
in
physically.
Turkey. I'll be in Turkey for 3 weeks in Zukash. Kash is a place where the first parliament was built, 10 miles away from the place where the first money was forged, and 20 miles away from Ephesus. So come to visit us. And the theme is civilization building. So
Perfect.
right on topic.
Small tasks, right?
Amazing. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye bye.
All right.
Take care. Bye.